Good morning and welcome to the Port of Los Angeles June Media Briefing. I'm Philip Sandfield, the Port's Communications Director. And once again, I'm pleased to be joined by Gene Soroka, Executive Director at the Port of Los Angeles. Greetings, Gene.
Hello, Philip, and thank you all for participating in today's briefing. It's a privilege to have this monthly dialogue with the media. And, as always, I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Gene, normally we'd begin this event with the latest monthly data, which we will share in a few minutes. But since there's been so much media coverage of the labor contract negotiations and its impact on West Coast ports, let's start there. What's the current status of the situation?
Well, Philip, these past couple of weeks have been challenging and at times confusing for all of us out here at the West Coast ports. Challenging indeed for service providers, cargo owners, and so many others. There have been claims, counterclaims, and daily concern as the contract talks between the International Longshore and Warehouse Union and the Pacific Maritime Association continue to push forward at the bargaining table in San Francisco. Here at the Port of Los Angeles, I think it's fair to say that while the situation remains fluid, we've largely been able to function close to normal since June 1. The Port of LA terminals are open, trucks are moving, and vessels, by and large, have been on schedule. For background and context, talks temporarily stalled on June 1st between the ILWU and the PMA, mainly over wages. That led to spot shortages of workers on our docks and sporadic delays for about a week at some terminals here in LA. Yet, as I noted, for the last 6 days, the Port of Los Angeles has had minimal disruption. Meanwhile, after a several-day pause, both parties continue to talk at the table on the remaining points in an ongoing effort to hammer out a deal. While our Port Optimizer and other data suggest that the overall impact on LA operations has been minimal, we fully recognize that some truckers and customers have experienced delays and frustrations in recent weeks. That said, let's take a quick look at some of the data we track so that you'll see the current activity, and it's pretty consistent compared to the last several months here at the Port of Los Angeles. I'll share 3 sets of numbers that we monitor. First, all about the vessels at berth, anchor, and those headed our way. Second, how long containers are waiting for their next move, what we call dwell times. And last, the number of boxes sitting at our terminals ready to go. First, on the vessel side, as you can see right now and compared to the last 60 days, things are pretty stable with one notable exception. That's the 58 ships that are on their way across the Pacific headed here to the Southern California Gateway. That tells me that we're looking pretty good when it comes to that cadence of calendar events for seasonal products. More on that in a moment. For the dwell times, also a pretty good story. Cargo waiting to leave by truck sits just a little more than 3 days. That's down to pre-pandemic levels or a little bit better. Cargo waiting to load on the on-dock rail at about 4 days is solid. What we're still watching, though, are the street dwell times, the containers and chassis waiting to be unloaded and returned back. It shows me that many importers are still using containers as mobile warehouses. And then finally, for the pure number of containers, the rail numbers waiting to be loaded onto cars, pretty good at 9,500. The total imports on the ground at our terminals is a little bit high at 42,200 units, but that shows that we had a really good weekend of vessel work. Mondays leading into Tuesday are usually high levels as we start to work that cargo off the docks and into the economy. And the empties are right about where we want them given the amount of exports we have loading to the ships headed back to Asia. Meanwhile, Acting Labor Secretary Julie Su has been collaborating with both sides to ensure negotiations stay on track. In fact, the Secretary flew to San Francisco yesterday and has met with both parties. She remains in the city today, working to break down those communication barriers, issues that we've been stuck on, and just keep the parties moving forward as they continue to bargain. It's clear that this is a top priority for the Biden-Harris administration. The bottom line for us, it's been 13 months. We need both sides to bargain in good faith and find a way to reach agreement quickly.
Thanks, Gene. We have several follow-up questions on this topic from the media, and we can address those in just a couple of minutes. First, though, let's shift to our latest cargo data. How did we do in May, and where are we holding year to date?
Philip, May volume landed at 779,000 TEUs, higher than what we projected for the month. Yet, it's still about 20% off last May's strong showing, but we've now had 3 consecutive months of volume increases. Overall, we've had a 60% increase in cargo volume compared to February's low water mark. And we're moving toward our pre-pandemic averages, with May only about 6% off our 5-year rolling average. Diving deeper into the May numbers, on the import side, we processed 409,000 TEUs, about 18% less than last year. Exports came in at 101,000 TEUs, a 19% year-on-year decline. And in a similar trend, the 268,000 units of empties back to Asia were down about 22%. The big picture, here's where we stand after 5 months. The Port of Los Angeles has moved 3.3 million TEUs. That's 27% less than our outstanding start last year, and 15% below the 5-year average. Looking ahead, if we can get a labor deal done soon, and the economy doesn't falter, we're poised for a stronger back half of the year.
Gene, can you elaborate on your expectations for June, the peak season, and the rest of 2023?
Glad to, Philip. Our early outlook for June indicates a range of 700 to 750,000 TEUs, with several factors still in play. We're keeping a close eye on our dock operations, productivity, and staffing levels. And as I noted earlier, we're seeing an uptick in ships bound for Los Angeles, which is an encouraging sign. Our performance for the remainder of the year depends on these 2 key factors. First, the West Coast labor deal. We need this resolved as soon as possible. And second, the U.S. economy. Variables such as inflation, jobs, and consumer spending directly impact our results. In terms of the labor deal, a contract agreement will be the first step in bringing cargo back to Los Angeles. This Thursday, I'll be in Tacoma, Washington, addressing the Agriculture Transportation Coalition led by Peter Friedman. Peter's group is one of many business associations across the country that have spoken out about the need to conclude these negotiations. I'm sensitive to the concerns of the AgTC and their members. This week, I intend to tell them that the Port of Los Angeles stands ready to help bring their cargo back to this gateway. And with respect to the economy, I remain optimistic. With the Port of Los Angeles being a leading economic indicator, the increase in Trans-Pacific vessels tells me seasonal product flow is picking up. Think back to school items, fall fashion, and the year-end holiday merchandise that are all now beginning to come our way. This week's economic data will begin to paint the picture for the second half of the year as well. We started with good news early this morning, and the Consumer Price Index dropped to 4% annualized in the month of May. That's the slowest pace of inflation in more than 2 years, and the 11th straight monthly decline of this all-important index. And that bodes well for tomorrow's update from the Fed on interest rates. Most analysts now expect a pause on those hikes, which would be welcomed by many. Later this week, we'll get the latest on U.S. retail sales, jobless claims, and consumer confidence levels, all of which are important segments that will influence the overseas orders of cargo owners in the coming months. Given all of that, a labor deal and a healthy U.S. economy will mean more cargo and more jobs here at the Port of Los Angeles.
Thank you, Gene, for that assessment. Now let's take some questions from the media. And as a reminder, if you'd like to ask one, please use the Q&A box below and make sure to include your name and affiliation. First question comes from Vanessa Yurkovich at CNN. Gene, are there growing concerns about which direction contract negotiations are headed?
Hi, Vanessa. Thanks for joining again. Of course we're all concerned. The deal's not done yet, but collective bargaining is hard work. In the case of the West Coast ports, there's not only this framework for a collective bargaining agreement at the international level, but we have 29 local supplements that have to be negotiated and codified simultaneously. I know patience is wearing thin, and both sides never imagined it would take this long, but we have to stick to the plan and see this to the end. It must be done the right way for workers' protections and as well to make sure these companies are competitive to bring more cargo back here to the West Coast ports and Los Angeles in particular. Thanks for joining, Vanessa.
Next question is from Edwin Lopez of Supply Chain Dive. How would you compare the West Coast port slowdowns in recent weeks to the cargo backups and work slowdowns in 2014-15?
Hi, Edwin. Thanks for joining today. There's really no comparison at this point. Although our situation remains fluid, as I reported just moments ago, there's only one ship at anchor here in the Southern California Gateway, and I'm told that that ship is simply waiting its operational instructions and will be in between 24 and 30 hours to begin work. Back in 2014, we had 31 ships at anchor, and it was the confluence of a number of events. You may remember it was the introduction of the Alliance vessel sharing structure to the Trans-Pacific trade. Cargo was distributed to a wider array of terminals than ever before. We also saw the divestiture of the chassis or trailer wheels that move the containers around by the ocean carriers and the introduction of the intermodal equipment participants, the IEPs, to managing those chassis in what later developed to be the pool of pools. And to top it all off, we had protracted labor negotiations that were going on about 9 months, once again longer than any of us could have imagined, much less the parties at the table. Here today, as I reported, the cargo is flowing. We still have a lot more work to do. There are spot shortages of workers. There are delays in moving. But all in all, given the circumstances, cargo is flowing pretty well. Thanks for joining, Edwin.
Gene, the next question comes from Lorianne LaRocco at CNBC. Gene, any guidance on the reasons why there are vessels delayed at the port? Is it a lack of lashers? What kind of key labor jobs are not coming in?
Yeah, the variety of issues every day, Lorianne. And again, I think going back to June 1st, when talks broke down reportedly over a difference of opinion on wages, down here in Southern California, ILW Local 13 voiced their displeasure by holding back on going out to the job. And that was noted in their public releases. So there are a variety of jobs and skills that are required every single day across the 12 terminals here in Los Angeles and Long Beach. I can't point my finger at any one job class, any one work group, or any one employer that's doing things differently. But safe to say, we're not operating at full capacity today. And that's why the focus needs to be on just moving that next container to the best of our ability and encouraging both sides to stay at the table, bargain in good faith, and get to a tentative agreement. Thanks for joining, Lorianne.
Gene, Lorianne has a follow-up question. Are you concerned if the ILWU Canada members do strike? Do you worry that the ILWU on the West Coast would strike in solidarity?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. While the two ports in British Columbia comprise about 7% of the Trans-Pacific market, any disruption to work, employer side, worker side, or any other reason is harmful to trade. So we hope that both sides up there in BC can continue to talk and reach resolution. I'm not going to speak for the ILWU, but please know that from where I sit, this great union here on the West Coast, including Alaska and Hawaii, has not gone out on strike since the early 1970s. Their DNA is that they want to go out on the job and work, and we need to see this contract to come to conclusion. Thanks.
Next question is from Deborah Belgium at Women's Wear Daily. Gene, what is happening with the arrival of cargo being brought in by rail, particularly from the Union Pacific?
Deborah, what reference do you have that what is happening? Cargo's moving as best as it can right now. I showed you the numbers earlier that we have about 9,500 units awaiting to load on rail cars to move out. You may be referring to the Union Pacific Railroad's guidance of over a week ago saying that they were going to pause service. That was recycled in about 24 hours to resume normal rail activity. But there are fits and starts every day. It's operations. It is the supply chain. And we're only as good as the next container we move. I don't see anything on the horizon that would be debilitating from a rail perspective, but as you saw from the data I look at, which goes into more deeper, complex, nuanced reviews and analysis, I think we're doing okay right now. But the whole purpose of utilizing the Port Optimizer and going through that data analytics is to make sure that we can see around corners and over hills before problems happen, so we can get to the ground and make sure that we continue to move all this cargo. Thanks, Deborah. Appreciate you joining.
Thank you, Gene. We have a few more questions in the queue. If anyone in the media has any more questions, please type those in now in the Q&A box. The next question is from Bill Mongaluzzo at the Journal of Commerce. The PMA has cited numerous ILWU job actions impacting operations, including refusal to dispatch sufficient lashers and making unfounded health and safety claims. In a larger sense, do these actions confirm the reputation that West Coast ports have unreliable labor?
Thanks for joining, Bill. I'm not going to validate one view against another, but again, from my vantage point, this is what impasse in bargaining looks like. Both sides are probably disappointed, upset, frustrated, any range of emotions when you get to this point. And the rank and file have been on the job every day. They want to get paid. They want this contract to come to conclusion. Over 13 months of bargaining on this particular agreement, the longest time I can remember, we've only had a handful of bad days. By and large, given the circumstances, everyone around this supply chain, from importers, exporters to service providers, and our longshore labor, have done the best they possibly can and will continue to do so. But getting this agreement done will be the next knock-on effect to everything else that we've been talking about. Thank you, Bill.
Question from William Lajeunesse at Fox News. How much of the decline in cargo relates to labor concerns versus any production slowdowns in China or the economy at large?
Hey, William, good to hear from you. It's been a while. As I've reported in previous media briefings, we're running at about 70% of capacity, may probably a little bit better than that. But take 70% of capacity as what our run rate has been. I've reported, based on what information I have, that about 15% of that open or latent capacity is cargo that's moved to the East and Gulf Coast, because importers, exporters, and business associations have told me directly they're very concerned about any type of disruption, whether it be from the service provider side or labor. And they tried to hedge, move their cargo away to what they consider a more certain environment. This is also not new. Over the last 20 years, we have seen market share declines that have been widely reported. Back in 2002, 80% of the Trans-Pacific trade moved via West Coast ports. Today, it is a 56% share. Folks back 20 years ago went to a port diversification or four-corner strategy to try to de-risk their supply chains. Ports on the East and Gulf Coast, along with British Columbia and Mexico ports, have hired switched-on leadership. They've aligned with their policymakers, made great investments in infrastructure, and put together a whole host of business-friendly regulations to bring cargo to their ports. We've got to be on offense, not playing defense anymore. We've got to go out and earn this cargo, and we've got to give that import and export community the reasons to come back here to Los Angeles. Big deal. The other 15% of that latent capacity right now is also what we've reported. Inventory levels remain high across the country. Folks are worried about the interest rates, the inflation levels, and we've put more and more of our discretionary income into the services sector. Every airplane you get on is full. Restaurants are packed. People are going back out to ball games and theaters. So there's been a shift compared to what we saw during the surge of COVID-19. A lot of differences here. But it is true that cargo has moved away because folks are really concerned about this contract. Yet we've only had, as I mentioned, several days where operations were not as fluid or smooth as we like to present on a regular basis. Thanks for joining once again, William.
Next question is from Laura Curtis at Bloomberg. Gene, with respect to Acting Secretary Sue and her work on the negotiations, is the Port of LA in communication with the White House, and have you called on them for more direct involvement?
Oh, good morning, Lauren. Thanks for joining again. We're in regular, if not daily, communication with senior officials at the White House. Acting Secretary of Labor Julie Su has been in communication with both parties since she was the Labor Secretary here in the state of California. That continued when she was appointed and confirmed as Deputy Secretary of U.S. Labor, and since she was put into the acting position by President Biden back in March. Her visit to San Francisco is further evidence that she continues to work with both parties in an effort to get a deal done. Julie and her staff have been working around the clock, and this is one of her highest priorities in the capacity of Secretary of Labor.
Thank you, Gene. A follow-up from Laura. As of yesterday, the Marine Exchange reported several vessels delayed in the San Pedro Bay. How significant is this, and at what point might we see bottleneck issues spreading through the port?
We don't want any delays in the supply chain, and after what we all worked through together over the past 4 years, we're very sensitive to this. But the vessels that are delayed right now are primarily classified as delayed in their departure back to Asia, and the delays, as per the Marine Exchange, are very minimal compared to what we witnessed during the pandemic. If your flight's delayed by 2 hours, that's a big deal if you're an air traveler. And if your ship is delayed going back to Asia, that's a big deal to the American exporter and other supply chain participants. So we've got to try to minimize that, stay on schedule as best we can, given all that's happening around us today. And as I mentioned, of those 42,000 imports that are right now on our docks here at the Port of Los Angeles, 90% of those are considered new, 0 to 4 days aging. That's the true value of the Port Optimizer, to be able to take a wider view of what's happening in the supply chain and be able to use these data analytics to make sense out of many reports and confusing times, as I reported to you earlier. Thanks, I appreciate it, Laura.
Gene, Edwin Lopez is following up with another question from Supply Chain Dive. He's noting that truckers are some of the stakeholders who have most noticed the slowdowns. They're saying that they've gone from 3 container moves a day now down to 1 or 2, partially due to slow gates or long lunches. Are you seeing this on our docks? Are you seeing this in the metrics? And any thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure, Edwin. That's reality. Again, as we've said publicly in other meetings at the Board of Harbor Commissioners, as well as today, there are slower moving containers than we'd like to see. And there are longer lines on occasion for trucks. We've even had terminals not open their truck gates due to a shortage of labor or other business decisions. So no, it's not all perfect. And yes, the trucker, our first and last mile ambassador of this port complex, is being hurt by any type of slowdown. We've got to avoid that going forward, if at all possible. 2/3 of all the cargo that moves in and out of the Port of Los Angeles and neighboring Port of Long Beach moves by the big rigs. These guys and ladies that drive these trucks are vitally important to this port and to their families. So we've got to do all we can to keep that cycle moving for number of turns per day, as they typically are compensated by the leg. Now, looking at the Port Optimizer on the truck turn times, the queuing times, we are seeing periodic spikes in the amount of time truckers are waiting. This is all public data, and it's out there for observers, media, and other industry parties to look at as they wish to see what's happening in real time here at the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. Thanks, Edwin.
Gene, Vanessa Yurkovich from CNN is just typing in another question here. Can you put into perspective the pandemic bottleneck versus what you're seeing today? Any bottleneck is obviously unwelcome, but help us understand how significant the differences are.
Yeah, great question, Vanessa. And from memory, I'll give you the snapshot. At its worst point in time, which was about October 25th of 2021, we had 97,000 containers on the docks. Today, we've got 42,000, and 90% of those are 0 to 4 days old. At that time, we had about 35 to 37,000 containers that were 9 days or older, representing more than 40% of all the cargo on the docks. And simultaneously, we had 89 ships at anchor outside the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. emitting pollution right around our neighborhoods where 260,000 people live in and around this harbor enclave. So very different than what we see today. Again, all things considered, cargo is moving, not as quickly as we would like, not without the frustrations that we could do without, but we're continuing to move the cargo. Thanks, Vanessa.
Thank you, Gene. This appears to be our last question. It's from Eric Watkins at Cargomatic. Do you have concerns that the reduced import orders into the U.S. will adversely affect factories and other suppliers in China once orders begin to ramp up? Will demand outstrip supply?
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate you joining once again today. I don't think so. There is latent capacity at the factory level throughout China. I worked there for a number of years, as you know, and I still keep up with a lot of friends and colleagues daily, weekly basis to understand what's happening in the marketplace. Realistically, this was a strange year. As you remember, back in February, factories closed down for the Lunar New Year holidays longer than traditionally, in some cases up to 30 days, because the purchase orders simply weren't there. We have reported high levels of inventory throughout the nation, retail goods, manufacturing, parts, components, and peripherals. The St. Louis Fed at one point earlier this year said our inventory sales ratio was at about 1.36, although off its all-time highs pre-pandemic. What we see on a normal basis is an inventory sales ratio of about 1.1, 1.15. So the orders going to the factories weren't that great. But as we see now, with 58 ships coming across the Pacific, volume is starting to pick up. Now, that is on cargo that is moving here that hasn't gone to the eastern Gulf Coast. But the numbers are picking up compared to our run rate of the previous months. The order cycle process by many retailers and other importers is usually between 90 and 120 days before a ship leaves. So that order goes into the factory about 3 or 4 months before the vessel departs coming here to Los Angeles. Another area I look at really closely, especially with the retail community, is canceled purchase orders. And I'm not seeing a significant number of cancellations at this time. So it appears to me that the merchandisers widely have this dialed in pretty well based on consumer demand and trends for purchasing, where the orders they're putting in are getting fulfilled and starting to move by air and ocean coming across the Pacific here. So I'm pretty confident right now we'll have capacity at factories. The orders will continue to pick up for our seasonal goods like back to school, fall fashion, and the year-end holidays. Appreciate it, Eric. Thanks for joining.
That concludes our media questions. Gene, back to you for final thoughts.
Thank you, Philip. In closing, I'd like to say a few words about LA Fleet Week. Every year at the Port of Los Angeles, we celebrate our nation's military and sea services over the Memorial Day weekend. And this year, by many accounts, was our best Fleet Week yet. Over the course of the 4-day weekend, the port was honored to connect tens of thousands of Southern Californians with a variety of activities right here on the LA waterfront. The Fleet Week Expo at the Battleship Iowa featured hands-on displays, aerial flyovers, interactive games, and live music. At our outer harbor, active U.S. Navy and Coast Guard vessels provided over 15,000 visitors with the opportunity for up-close tours. During their Fleet Week visit, nearly 1,300 sailors, Marines, soldiers, and Coast Guard members called San Pedro their home base. And thanks to over 100 organized events and activities across the greater LA region, an estimated 250,000 people were able to engage with our service members. LA Fleet Week has evolved into a venue for U.S. military operations and regional coordination, as well as policy discussions. Multiple forums were held during the event, and I had the opportunity to participate in several, including one on maritime strategy and policy. It was truly touching to witness active military personnel taking part in local Memorial Day services to honor the fallen, including a moving tribute performed by the United States Navy Band at Disneyland. Above all, LA Fleet Week provides all of us with the chance to express our appreciation and support for the brave individuals serving in the U.S. Navy, Coast Guard, Marines, and Army. It also serves as a moment to acknowledge and celebrate our port's history and relationship with the U.S. Sea Services. That history spans more than 100 years. From 1907 to 1940, the Pacific Fleet was stationed here in the San Pedro Bay. During the peak of World War II, over 90,000 women and men worked in our shipyards and warehouses every day. They were responsible for building and loading hundreds of Victory-class cargo ships, which then carried essential supplies from our homeland to the Allies in battle across the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The port takes great pride in building this LA Fleet Week tradition. From Jonathan Williams and the entire LA Fleet Week Foundation, to the people within our harbor department, the success of such a major undertaking rests on the shoulders of so many. I'd like to thank Los Angeles Port Police, headed by Chief Tom Gazy, our events team, which includes community relations and graphic staff led by Arlie Baker, construction and maintenance, media relations, port pilots, wharfingers, real estate, and dozens of employee and community volunteers. It truly was an all-hands undertaking. Thanks for joining us today. We look forward to being with you again in July. Take care, everyone.